Carl and Claudia Hoerig seemed like the perfect couple, an Air Force pilot and his charming wife living the American dream. But behind their smiles hid a storm of secrets, jealousy, and betrayal. What began as a story of love and devotion would spiral into one of the most chilling crimes imaginable. A murder so calculated that it shattered the illusion of their perfect marriage forever. Carl Hoerig had always been the kind of man people admired. Disciplined, polite, and dependable, he carried himself with quiet confidence that came from years of military service. Friends and colleagues respected him, neighbors liked him, and even strangers could sense the calm steadiness in his voice. He wasn't flashy or loud. He was simply solid, a man whose word meant something. When he met Claudia, it seemed like life had finally given him more than duty and routine. She was everything he wasn't, spontaneous, emotional, and full of charm. She could turn a quiet evening into something vibrant and alive. For Carl, it was refreshing. For Claudia, it was security, the kind she had always longed for. Their love story started like a scene out of a movie. They met through mutual friends and quickly became inseparable. Carl admired her energy and humor, while Claudia loved the stability he offered. After a whirlwind romance, they married in a small ceremony surrounded by close family and friends. The couple soon moved into a modest but beautiful home in a quiet suburban neighborhood, where everything seemed picture perfect. They planted flowers in the front yard, decorated the house with care, and hosted dinners that made everyone feel welcome. To the outside world, they were the embodiment of love and success, a couple who had found balance between affection and ambition. But behind the smiles and polished image, small cracks began to form. Carl's career as an Air Force pilot demanded long hours and frequent travel. He was often away for days or weeks at a time, leaving Claudia to fill the silence of the empty house. At first, she told herself it was fine. She understood the nature of his work. But as months passed, her patience wore thin. The same independence that had once attracted Carl now started to create distance. She wanted attention, affection, and constant companionship. Carl, dedicated to his responsibilities, failed to notice how lonely she had become. Their conversations grew shorter. The warmth in their laughter faded. Meals together turned into quiet moments filled with unspoken tension. Carl, believing the strain was temporary, tried to smooth things over by giving her gifts and planning small trips. Claudia smiled and thanked him, but her mind was already elsewhere. She began to imagine a different kind of life, one where she wasn't waiting by the window for her husband to come home. Neighbors noticed subtle changes. Claudia, once friendly and talkative, became distant. She stopped attending community gatherings and began spending more time alone. Carl, when he was home, seemed distracted, as if he sensed something was wrong but couldn't identify what. On the surface, they were still the ideal couple, but those who looked closely could see the emptiness behind their polite smiles. Claudia's restlessness deepened. She filled her days with errands and unnecessary trips, often driving aimlessly just to escape the quiet house. At night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how love could turn into something so hollow. Carl, unaware of how far things had slipped, continued to believe that time would fix everything. He trusted that love was enough, that their bond would survive the distance. But love built on loneliness can turn fragile, and theirs was beginning to crack under the weight of unmet expectations. By the end of that year, their marriage looked perfect from afar, but felt cold up close. The spark that once lit up their lives had dimmed to a faint glow. Neither of them knew it, but they were already standing on the edge of something irreversible. Every small argument, every quiet dinner, and every night spent apart was pulling them closer to a tragedy, waiting to unfold. What began as a love story built on admiration and trust was slowly transforming into something darker, something that would one day shock everyone who thought they knew the Hoerigs at Claudia's. World had begun to shrink into silence, and with every passing week, she felt trapped between what she had and what she believed she deserved. The house she once adored now felt like a cage. The photos on the wall that captured moments of joy became reminders of how far they had drifted. Carl's military schedule kept him busy, and even when he was home, his presence felt distant. He spoke about discipline, honor, and the next flight mission, while Claudia thought about escape. She didn't want to live in the shadow of a man who was always gone. Slowly, she began carving out a life that existed completely outside of her marriage. It started harmlessly. Longer lunches with co-workers, a few drinks after work, small lies that made her absences easier to explain. But soon the deception became routine. She found thrill in secrecy, in knowing she could hide parts of herself Carl would never see. She started dressing differently, speaking differently, and surrounding herself with people who didn't know her as the quiet wife of an Air Force pilot. She liked the freedom, the feeling of being noticed, the illusion that she was in control. Carl, for his part, noticed changes he couldn't understand. Claudia had grown sharper in her tone, more defensive when he asked simple questions. He assumed it was stress or loneliness and tried to reassure her with patience. But his calmness only fueled her resentment. She wanted emotion, proof that he cared enough to fight for her, but Carl's restraint made her feel invisible. The gap between them widened until it felt like they were living separate lives under the same roof. By the time Claudia's secret life took full form, there was no trace of the woman Carl had fallen in love with. She began communicating with someone from her past, a man she had known before meeting Carl, and through that connection, old habits and ambitions resurfaced. Conversations that started as innocent catch-ups soon turned into emotional confessions, and emotional confessions turned into something much more dangerous. She began imagining a different future, one where she could start over, free from obligations, guilt, and the silent weight of her marriage. Money became her first focus. She started withdrawing small amounts from their joint account, careful not to draw attention. She sold a few pieces of jewelry, claiming she wanted to redecorate the house. In reality, she was building a quiet reserve, a way out. Carl didn't question it. He trusted her completely, a trust that made her plans easier to execute. While he was away on missions, Claudia used those long stretches of solitude to organize her next moves. She looked up flights, contacted people abroad, and began preparing documents. Every detail was planned with precision. Still, beneath the cold calculations, there was a storm of emotions. Claudia wasn't entirely heartless. She oscillated between guilt and justification, between the woman she once was and the one she had become. Late at night, she'd sit by the window, staring into the suburban street, thinking about the life she was destroying. But every time she tried to imagine fixing it, resentment took over again. She convinced herself that Carl was the reason for her unhappiness, that she was merely reclaiming the life he had stolen through neglect. To everyone around them, nothing seemed unusual. The Hoerig still attended social gatherings, still smiled for pictures, still gave the impression of stability. But behind closed doors, their home felt colder than ever. Carl's optimism began to fade. He could feel the energy shift but couldn't grasp the truth. Claudia's detachment wasn't just emotional anymore. It had become strategic. She was no longer thinking about saving her marriage, but about ending it in a way that would give her complete control. The plans she made weren't rushed or impulsive. They were deliberate, measured, and chillingly calm. Every lie she told was a step closer to freedom. And every time Carl kissed her goodbye before another flight, she was one day closer to betraying him completely. What had started as a desire for attention had evolved into something darker, something that hinted not just at abandonment, but at destruction. Claudia had crossed the line where unhappiness ends and danger begins, and though no one knew it yet, the countdown to tragedy had already begun. The morning that would end, everything began like any other. The sun filtered softly through the blinds, and the suburban street outside was alive with the quiet hum of daily life. Carl Hoerig was up early, as usual, dressed neatly, his routine precise and predictable. He moved through the kitchen with the calm focus of a man accustomed to order. To him, it was just another workday, another chance to serve and fly. But across the room, Claudia watched him with eyes that carried something far colder than distance, an unnerving calm born from finality. For weeks she had rehearsed every moment in her mind. The timing, the details, even the sound of his footsteps. The plan had taken shape piece by piece, fueled by anger, exhaustion, and an unshakable conviction that this was the only way out. She no longer saw Carl as her husband. She saw him as the obstacle between her and freedom. Every word he spoke that morning blurred into background noise. Her decision had already been made, and there was no going back. Carl had no reason to suspect that the woman standing a few feet away was about to end his life. He carried on with his routine, packing his flight gear, checking his schedule, glancing occasionally at Claudia with the detached politeness that had become their norm. Maybe he sensed the tension, maybe he didn't. If he did, he likely mistook it for another argument waiting to happen. Claudia, however, wasn't thinking about arguments. She was thinking about silence, about making sure there would be no more fights, no more guilt, no more pretending. The air in the house was heavy, almost unnaturally still. Claudia's heart pounded beneath the mask of composure. Every step she took toward her decision felt rehearsed and unreal, as though she was watching herself from outside her own body. Her mind was frighteningly clear. There was no rage, no trembling, just cold precision. In another life, it might have been a morning filled with small affection, a shared breakfast, or a brief kiss before parting ways. Instead, it was the last quiet moment before chaos. The sound of the shot broke through the calm like the world splitting open. It was sharp, final, and horrifyingly quick. In a matter of seconds, Carl's life, the years of service, the laughter with friends, the dreams of growing old, was gone. The silence that followed was deafening. Claudia stood frozen, staring at what she had done, her pulse racing so fast she could barely breathe. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the faint scent of coffee still lingering in the air. For a brief moment she expected to feel regret, panic, something human. But what came instead was emptiness. It was as if her emotions had been stripped away, leaving behind only the need to act. She moved with eerie composure, setting things in place exactly as planned. She made sure there would be no signs of a struggle, no time for him to have called for help. Her movements were methodical, almost mechanical. Within minutes, the house looked deceptively calm again, like nothing had happened at all. She gathered what she needed, her passport, her packed bag, and the cash she had quietly set aside. Her flight was already arranged, and every step from that point forward was part of an escape she had engineered long before the morning began. As she walked out the door, she didn't look back. The suburban street glowed under the morning sun, ordinary and unsuspecting. Neighbors watered their lawns, children waited for the school bus, and no one had any idea that behind the Hoerig's front door lay the body of a man who had once been loved. By the time the day gave way to evening, Carl's friends were trying to reach him, unaware that their messages would go unanswered forever. The house remained still, the lights off, the life inside extinguished, and miles away on a plane bound for another country, Claudia sat quietly, blending in among the passengers. She had traded her identity for anonymity, her marriage for exile. The life she had built and destroyed was now behind her, buried in that quiet suburban home where love had turned into death. When Carl failed to report for duty, alarm spread quickly through the base. It was unlike him to miss a shift, let alone vanish without notice. Calls went unanswered, messages piled up, and within hours a welfare check was requested. When officers arrived at the Hoerig home, they found the front door locked and the blinds drawn. Everything about the house seemed undisturbed, too quiet for comfort. After forcing entry, what they found inside would shatter the illusion of a perfect marriage forever. The body of Carl Hoerig was discovered near the staircase. The scene told a story of calm precision rather than chaos. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle, no robbery. Only the haunting stillness of a home that had become a crime scene. The officers' voices echoed through the empty halls as they secured the area, documenting every detail. The stillness of the air, the faint scent of cleaning products, and the unnerving order of the surroundings hinted that whoever had done this had acted with intention. The first question they asked was the simplest: where was Claudia? Her car was gone. Her phone was off. There was no note, no trace, no indication she had been harmed or kidnapped. As investigators dug deeper, the truth began to unfold like pieces of a grim puzzle. Carl's financial records showed unusual withdrawals over the past few months. Airline searches from their home computer revealed recent activity for international flights. Witnesses recalled seeing Claudia running errands days before the murder, calm and unhurried. Every new piece of evidence pointed toward one conclusion: she hadn't fled in panic. She had planned everything. The search for Claudia quickly turned international. Authorities discovered that hours after Carl's estimated time of death, Claudia Hoerig had boarded a flight out of the country. Using her Brazilian passport, she had slipped past every checkpoint before anyone knew a crime had occurred. Once the story broke, it spread fast. Air Force pilot murdered by wife who fled overseas. The shocking contrast between the couple's once perfect image and the brutality of the crime captivated the public. Neighbors were stunned, colleagues heartbroken. People who had once envied their marriage were now left questioning how such darkness could have been hiding behind a suburban facade. As investigators pieced together her life before the murder, a disturbing portrait emerged. Claudia had been meticulous, even strategic, in her preparations. She had transferred funds, sold personal belongings, and liquidated assets months before the killing. She had reached out to old acquaintances in Brazil, making quiet inquiries about starting over. The evidence painted her as someone who had made peace with her decision long before she pulled the trigger. Yet despite her planning, she left behind inconsistencies, small details that hinted at emotional turmoil beneath the surface. Interpol was soon involved, and American authorities began diplomatic efforts to secure her return. But the process was anything but simple. Brazil's laws on extraditing citizens were strict, and Claudia, being a dual national, had the protection of her birth country. The case became tangled in legal and political debates stretching over years. While investigators built their case, time became her greatest ally. She vanished into the rhythm of another country, blending into crowds, changing her appearance, and learning how to disappear in plain sight. Meanwhile, Carl's family refused to let the story fade. They turned grief into determination, pushing for justice through every available channel. They spoke to media outlets, contacted officials, and refused to let the case grow cold. For them, Claudia's escape was not just an insult, it was an open wound. They wanted the world to remember Carl not as a victim, but as a man whose kindness and trust had been betrayed in the most unimaginable way. The years that followed turned the case into legend among investigators, a story of a killer who planned every move yet underestimated the persistence of those she left behind. Though Claudia was free, she lived under the shadow of pursuit, her name tied forever to the husband she had left behind in silence. Somewhere across borders and oceans, she built a life on lies, never knowing how close the law was creeping toward her. The perfect escape she had imagined was slowly unraveling, and the truth she had buried was making its way back to the surface. Years passed, but the memory of Carl Hoerig's death refused to fade. His family kept his story alive, and investigators continued to work quietly behind the scenes, gathering every lead that could bring Claudia back to face justice. The case became a haunting reminder of how easily someone could slip through the cracks of international law. While most people moved on, those who had known Carl never stopped waiting for the day she would be found. And then, one morning, years after the murder, a message reached U.S. authorities. Someone had spotted a woman in Brazil who looked exactly like Claudia Hoerig. The lead came from a small town far from the bustling cities, where Claudia had been living under a new name. She had blended into the local community with ease, presenting herself as a quiet, friendly woman with a mysterious past. She kept her distance from anyone who asked too many questions, worked low-profile jobs, and avoided attention. For years she had succeeded, but time has a way of wearing down even the best lies. One mistake, a careless mention of her past, a document left unchecked, was enough to reopen the trail. When investigators confirmed her identity, they began the long, difficult process of bringing her back. It wasn't simple. Claudia was a Brazilian citizen by birth, and Brazilian law forbade the extradition of its nationals for crimes committed abroad. What followed was a tense legal battle between two countries, filled with petitions, hearings, and political pressure. Carl's family appeared in interviews demanding accountability. They spoke about justice, about closure, about the years they had lost waiting for a resolution. Their persistence drew attention to the case once more, and slowly, the weight of public outrage began to shift the balance. After extensive negotiations, Brazil finally agreed to a rare arrangement that allowed her return under specific conditions. When she was finally escorted onto a plane, she looked calm, almost detached, as if she had accepted her fate long before the cuffs closed around her wrists. It was the end of her running, the moment when her double life collapsed into truth. The woman who had once stood in a suburban kitchen, calculating her husband's death, was now being flown back to face the country she had fled from. Her trial became a spectacle, followed closely by media across the world. In court, Claudia appeared composed, wearing a faint expression of remorse that some saw as genuine and others as practiced. The evidence against her was overwhelming. The flight records, the bank withdrawals, the careful preparation, and the lack of any sign of remorse in the aftermath of the killing. The prosecution painted her as cold and manipulative, a woman who had chosen murder over honesty. The defense tried to frame her as desperate, trapped in a loveless marriage and acting out of fear. But the jury saw through every attempt to soften her image. When the verdict came, the courtroom was silent. Guilty on all counts. The judge's voice echoed through the room as the sentence was read: life in prison. Claudia showed little reaction, only a slight nod as though she had expected nothing less. For Carl's family, it was a bittersweet victory. Justice had finally been served, but it came years too late to heal the wounds she had left behind. The man they loved was gone, and the woman who took him from them had lived free for far too long. In the end, Claudia was left with the same emptiness she had once felt in her marriage. The freedom she had chased had led her to a cell. The future she planned reduced to confinement. The world outside moved on, but her name remained frozen in the story that had defined her. The Hoerig marriage, once seen as a symbol of love and success, was now remembered only as a cautionary tale of deceit and destruction. It stood as a reminder that beneath the surface of even the most beautiful love stories, darkness can quietly grow, and sometimes it ends not with heartbreak, but with a gunshot.